8 target species, which depend on farmland as habitats. And there are 4 habitats that are targeted: grassland, croplands, green landscape elements, and blue landscape elements. And the objective of the approach is to ensure an effective management at a suitable location for those targeted species. To achieve these objectives, measures are spatially targeted, which means that they can be only implemented in favorable areas for the targeted species. And moreover, measures are coordinated in space so that a favorable habitat is created, for instance, by having suitable breeding and foraging sites next to each other. So how does this work in practice? The provinces establish nature management plans where target species, areas, and management specifications are delineated. Collective submit an application and are granted a collective contract for the total area of measures to be implemented. And the collective sign individual contracts with their members, provide technical support, and stimulate knowledge exchange for an effective implementation. In this study, we focused on the cropland habitats and the 17 bird species that depend on this habitat during the breeding season. We analyzed the 2 main agri-environmental measures designed to provide habitat to these species. First, the bird plots, which are all fields with an intercropping of perennial grass and biodiverse fallows. And those plots aim to provide habitats, especially to skylarks, because they have alfalfa, which is favorable for these species, and also food, insects, mice, especially mice for birds of prey, and insects and seeds to other species. The field margins is the second measure. These are field edges sown with biodiverse fallows and managed extensively, then to provide foraging and nesting habitat to a range of species. We had 2 main objectives in this study. First, we wanted to assess the effects of collective agri-environmental measures on the abundance of the breeding cropland bird species. And second, we wanted to identify important landscape factors that have an influence on this abundance. And from the results to the first 2 questions, we aim to draw useful lessons for the spatial targeting and cohesion of measures. A few words on the method used in the study. We analyzed bird monitoring data collected during 4 years in 4 collectives in 3 provinces: Groningen, Drenthe, and Flevoland. The data was collected by SOVON, the Dutch Center for Field Ornithology, on behalf of the collectives. And we used the sum of birds observed in plots during the breeding season. Each plot was visited 3 times at the start, middle, and end of the breeding season. We had data of 800 plots, field margins, bird plots, and control plots. Control plots are plots with conventional agricultural practices, which otherwise have similar characteristics than plots with agri-environmental measures. We analyzed the relations between birds' abundance and management of the plots, as well as landscape factors. And to analyze this relation, we use generalized linear mixed models with a log link and Poisson or generalized Poisson distribution. In this study, we define a landscape from the perspective of the ecology of the studied species. That is, a landscape is an area of land that contains habitat patches used by these species to breed, forage, and shelter. And consequently, the landscape size is defined per species based on their typical foraging range. We analyzed the effect of 4 types of landscape factors: crop types and crop diversity, land cover other than agricultural, the structure of the landscape, and the cohesion of agri-environmental measures. For this latter category, we had 2 variables. We calculated the percentage of landscape covered by other measures in the spring to check the effect of the spatial concentration of measures in the landscape. And we also calculated the percentage of landscape covered by measures in the winter to check the effect of the temporal continuity of measures. This is relevant for species wintering and breeding in the same zones. We analyzed 8 species separately Broadly, they correspond to three groups. Species breeding on the ground in crops with a preference for open landscapes. These are the wagtail and the skylark. Species breeding in shrubs and high vegetation with a preference for half-open, small-scale landscapes. These are the yellowhammer, the linnet, the pigeon, and the kestrel. And waders, the lapwing and the oystercatcher, which breed in grassland or berserks in croplands and prefer open landscapes. The 9 other species on the right of the slide were recorded in too small numbers to allow per species analysis. That is because they are very difficult to detect and or very rare. However, we analyzed also the total number of species and the total abundance of the 17 species targeted by the measures. So these 9 species are also somehow involved in the analysis via those two indicators. Before proceeding further with the results, I have to precise that this work is still in progress. So these results are still preliminary and require confirmation. We expect the study to be completed and submitted for publication in a scientific journal in the second trimester of this year. So on these result slides, you will see tables like that. Those tables show which variables are related to the bird's abundance for each of the 8 studied species, the total number of species, and the total abundance. A plus means a positive relationship, a minus a negative one, and the more plus or minus, the more significant is the relationship. So about the effects of management, we detected a positive effects of the bird plots on the skylark and the yellowhammer. So bird plots include strips of alfalfa managed extensively, which provides a suitable breeding habitat to skylarks. And in the case of yellowhammer, the bird plots are more likely used as foraging habitats. We did not find a positive effect or an effect of bird plots on other species in the 8 studied species. However, we see a weakly significant positive effect on the species number and a significant positive effect on total abundance. Regarding the field margins, they benefit a larger range of species with significant positive effects for all except the 2 wader species. The effects of field margin are especially strong for the skylark, the yellowhammer, and the linnets. And overall, field margins have a significant positive effect on the number of species and total abundance. Lapwing and oystercatcher don't benefit from any of the 2 measures. And this is what could be expected because these 2 species breed on bare grounds and prefer low vegetation as they are ground foragers. So the vegetation of the studied measures is too high and dense to be favorable for them. There are other measures that target these species, for instance, the protection of nests by postponing first agricultural operations in spring, but we did not analyze these measures in this study. We did not find a strongly significant effect of crop types, except for the fallows on the abundance of the kestrel and total abundance. Kestrel use fallows as foraging habitat to prey on mice. With regards to the wagtail, the negative effects of rapeseed, root crops, and intensive grasslands reflect the preference of these species to breed in winter cereals. This variable was not included in the models because it was too correlated with other crop types variables. The intensive grasslands are positively associated with the lapwing and the oystercatcher. So they are seen as favorable places to establish nests, probably thanks to the abundance of prey due to manure applications. However, a high share of nests will be destroyed by early and frequent mowing in these intensively managed grasslands. So in the end, they will often be ecological traps with a very low success of breeding. In terms of land cover and landscape structure, our results reflect that most of the studied species prefer open landscapes and avoid urban and built-up areas, edges and tree lines and forests. However, some species react differently to these factors. For instance, the pigeon is frequently nesting close to farmyards. And the presence of shrubs and small edges is also favorable to the linnet. In our result, this is reflected by a negative effect of the mean field size. So this species favors landscapes where field size is small, which means a higher density of field margins with shrubs and hedgerows where this species can establish its nest. The landscape factor edges and tree lines is not favorable for the linnet because in our map, this land cover class only includes the large hedges and trees, which the linnet does not use. Surprisingly, we found no effect of spatial concentration of measures in the landscapes, and even a negative effect for two species, the wagtail and the yellowhammer. Why is it the case? There are various possible explanations. First is there is a certain correlation between the plot management and the percentage of measures in the landscapes, as measures tends to be clustered. So the model may attribute the positive effect to plot management rather than the percentage of measures in the landscape. For instance, that is the case for the skylark. Field margins and bird plots are also they are merged in the variable percentage of measures in the landscape, and these two aspects, these two type of measures may have contrasting effects. So it would be worth testing them separately. And there may be also some non-linearity in the relation between the percentage of measures in the landscape and birds' abundance. So there may be some thresholds or ceilings in the relationship. If we take, for instance, the example of the wagtail, a too high percentage of measures in landscapes may be associated with less winter cereal cover. And for this species, this would not be beneficial since the wagtail depends on winter cereals as breeding habitat, and the measures are not used as breeding habitat by this species. So overall, this aspect of the effect of spatial concentration of measures requires really a further analysis and careful interpretation before we can draw conclusions. Regarding temporal cohesion, we found a positive effect of winter measures in landscapes for one species, the linnet, but we did not find this for other species present in both breeding and winter seasons, such as the yellowhammer, for instance. In conclusion, measures provide attractive habitat patches to 6 of the 8 studied species. They have a positive effect on species richness and total abundance of the targeted cropland species. The presence of fallows in landscape is attractive, and most species favor open landscapes, so we'll avoid forest and urban and semi-built-up areas especially. There are remaining open questions in our study. First one is, did the collective approach improve the spatial targeting of measures? And to assess that, we need to compare the spatial location and the landscape characteristics of plots, of ARM plots before 2016 and after 2016. 2016 was the first year of the implementation of the collective approach. This is not something we have yet done. The second aspect, as we have seen, is that the effects of spatial cohesion of measures requires further research. And the last aspect is that we still have to determine the effects beyond the plots of the measures. So how the target species populations responds to the agri-environmental management at a regional scale, which we cannot establish with the kind of data we had. Lastly, I would like to thank people who supported this research, so especially Buren Nature and the involved collectives who facilitated the access to the data on the implementation measures and monitoring of species. And also a special thanks to Eric Leher from Sauvon, the Dutch research organization on field ornithology, for supporting the study as well. And I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to answer your questions during the Q&A.